Welcome to the moment the Third Reich began to dissolve, not in fire but in silence. April 1945, 325,000 German soldiers laid down their weapons without a single order to do so. Entire divisions, gone overnight. No last stand, no gunfire echoing through the valleys, just the sound of boots in the mud, rifles dropped into puddles, and the hollow wind whispering through ruined villages. It's a moment almost too strange to believe. A war built on obedience and death ending in surrender and quiet. These weren't deserters, they were veterans of the Eastern Front of Normandy, of the Ardennes. Men who had fought through 5 years of slaughter, now choosing captivity over honor. What made them stop fighting? What broke them? Fear, fatigue, or something deeper? Something human. The cameras of the U.S. Army Signal Corps caught the faces of men who no longer belonged to an army, only to history. Blank eyes, cracked hands, uniforms turned to dust. You can almost hear the breath they exhale, the sound of an empire collapsing one man at a time. March 1945. Western Germany. The air thick with smoke and surrender. American tanks pushed through the Rhine, cutting roads surrounding cities, swallowing whole divisions. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of an ending. Villages burned, bridges fell, radios hissed, and somewhere deep inside that chaos a decision spread like a virus: stop fighting. Go west. Find the Americans. Because to the east lay the Red Army, vengeance in human form. To the west, the Americans whose food and mercy were worth more than any uniform, still clinging to pride. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Imagine standing there, boot-soaked, weapon useless, watching your comrades walk away toward the sound of engines and freedom. What would you do if your war was already lost? They surrendered not because they were beaten, but because they finally understood that fighting on meant dying for nothing. This is the story of the day 5,000 men stopped believing and chose to live instead. March 1945. Western Germany was unraveling. Villages, once proud and untouched, now lay in ruin walls, collapsed inward, windows, shattered smoke rising in thin blue ribbons that curled into the gray spring sky. The ground was soaked with melted snow and oil. Horses stumbled through mud beside convoys of broken trucks. The air smelled of gasoline, fear, and the faint sweetness of rotting bread. Every step forward felt like walking through the bones of a dying empire. The Americans were coming fast, faster than anyone thought possible. Their tanks had crossed the Rhine. That mighty river the Germans once believed impassable. It wasn't a slow crawl. It was a storm. The sound of their engines rolled through valleys and forests, echoing off stone churches and hollow barns. Villagers who had once cheered the Wehrmacht now stood silent in doorways, watching the endless procession of men and metal moving east. The rhythm of the war had changed. It was no longer a march of conquest, but a flood of retreat. Somewhere near Remagen, a bridge still stood. The Ludendorff Bridge, blackened by smoke but unbroken. When American soldiers captured it intact, the impossible became real. Thousands of men crossed the Rhine in days, their shadows stretching long in the morning mist. German soldiers on the far bank watched in disbelief. They had been told the river was a wall, now it was a doorway. A wound, an omen that the end was near. In the forests of the Eifel and along the edges of the Ruhr, German divisions were scattered, divided by confusion and the sheer force of the Allied advance. Radios crackled with half-orders: hold your position, fall back, defend the line. But what line? There were no lines left, only chaos. Officers who still wore their medals pretended to command, but the men had stopped listening. Hunger had stripped away discipline. The belief that once burned in their eyes had turned to smoke. At night, the glow of American flares painted the clouds pink. The hum of their aircraft never stopped. To the east, the ground trembled with the rumble of the Red Army moving closer each day. The Germans were caught between two storms, one slow and merciless, the other fast and deafening. Every man knew the stories. Tales from the Eastern Front whispered through the ranks. Entire villages burned. Prisoners vanished. Families never heard from again. The Soviets had no mercy left to give, and the men of the Wehrmacht, for all their pride, knew they had earned that hatred. So they made a choice not as soldiers, but as men. If they were to be captured, better to fall into American hands. Better to face the unknown warmth of an enemy who fed his captives than the cold vengeance of one who buried them alive. It was not strategy. It was instinct. The will to survive had replaced the will to obey. Everywhere the signs of collapse were visible. Columns of prisoners marched along roads once filled with panzer divisions. White flags hung from farmhouses. In some towns, church bells rang when the Americans arrived, not in celebration, but in relief. The war had devoured everything: fathers, sons, even faith. Now the people just wanted it to stop. The Americans, too, felt the weight of what they saw. Journal entries from soldiers speak of endless streams of captives, thin and silent, their boots leaving shallow prints in the mud. One wrote that they looked more like refugees than soldiers. When we told them to line up, they thanked us. Another, from the 99th Infantry Division, described walking past hundreds of Germans with their hands raised. No resistance, he said, just eyes, tired, empty eyes. The contrast was surreal. These were the same men who had fought viciously in the Ardennes just months earlier, who had ambushed convoys, destroyed tanks, and refused to yield even in the coldest nights. But now, they were undone. The might of the Reich had melted into shivering lines of men trudging westward. To the camera lenses of American correspondents, it must have seemed like history folding in on itself, the end of an empire captured in black and white. Some soldiers smiled as they surrendered, others wept, but most simply stood still, waiting for orders from an enemy they no longer feared. Everywhere the air hummed with contradictions. You could hear laughter from American mess tents, jazz on a portable radio, the clatter of tin cups. Just a few hundred yards away, German prisoners huddled under blankets, their breath rising in thin white clouds. War and peace existed side by side, separated only by a barbed wire fence. In the ruined streets of Essen, a young American lieutenant watched as prisoners filled the town square. He noted in his diary that they arrived faster than the army could process them, thousands a day. Some surrendered with notes written by their officers saying, "We can no longer fight. We ask for humane treatment." Others carried small tokens, family photos, a piece of bread, a letter that would never reach home. The local people watched silently. For years they had been told that Germany would never fall, that the Führer's will was eternal. But now even the radio had gone quiet. All that remained were the voices of the victors, the rumble of trucks, and the soft, weary steps of the defeated. And yet, amid this collapse, there was still an eerie kind of dignity. Many prisoners stood tall as they handed over their weapons. They didn't beg. They didn't speak much. They simply waited, as if this surrender was a release, the final act of a nightmare too long endured. In some places, American officers tried to count them, but there were too many. In others, entire regiments surrendered to a single jeep. It became routine, almost mechanical. Raise your hands, drop your weapon, walk toward the west. Each man became a number, a shadow, a statistic in the grand ledger of the war. But behind every number was a story, a farm left behind, a mother waiting, a letter never answered. You could see it in their faces, the guilt of what they had done, the relief of still being alive, the uncertainty of what came next. and above them all the sky remained gray, heavy with smoke and memory. The land was broken, but the silence that followed the gunfire was almost beautiful. It was the silence of survival, and of a world learning painfully that even empires bleed when they fall. The roads to surrender stretched for miles, rivers of men flowing west, away from vengeance toward the strange mercy of their enemies. And somewhere in that endless line of gray coats and tired eyes, the last echo of the Third Reich faded into the soil of its own making. Because sometimes the end of a war doesn't come with victory. It comes when men finally choose to stop killing. The numbers tell a story that words alone can't carry. Cold, precise, undeniable. In the span of 3 weeks between late March and mid-April 1945, more than 325,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies. It wasn't the result of a single battle. It was the slow collapse of a machine that had once ruled half of Europe. In military reports, it was called the encirclement of the Ruhr. To those who were there, it felt like the earth itself had given up. The Ruhr region, heart of German industry, cradle of its steel and coal, became a cage. Bounded by the Rhine in the west and the Siegfried Line in the east, it had once supplied the engines of Hitler's war. Now, under Allied pressure, it was turning into a prison of its own making. When U.S. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group closed the jaws from the west, and British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group sealed it from the north, a pocket was formed, massive, silent, and full of men who suddenly realized they had nowhere left to go. Official communiques from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, list the numbers with the detachment of accountants, April 18, 1945, 325,000. Enemy personnel surrendered. Casualties negligible. But behind those sterile lines were rivers of soldiers, not corpses. The Americans weren't killing them. They were absorbing them, processing them like waves against a shore. Trucks overflowed with prisoners. Temporary enclosures sprang up in fields surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by exhausted men with rifles who had long stopped seeing the enemy as monsters. At the height of it, reports describe scenes almost unimaginable. Thousands of German soldiers marching with their hands raised, columns stretching for miles down country roads. Each unit approached American lines, dropped their weapons, and waited. There were no negotiations, no dramatic gestures, only fatigue. The U.S. Army's records mention that some officers surrendered their units to a single American jeep. One captain wrote, "They arrived faster than we could count them." Documents from the U.S. Ninth Army describe a surreal statistic. On April 14th alone, over 80,000 prisoners were registered within 24 hours. The following day, another 60,000. Field reports use words like unprecedented, overwhelming logistical crisis. The American Army, designed to fight and destroy, suddenly had to feed, shelter, and transport more men than it could comprehend. In some areas, captured Germans outnumbered their guards 10-1. The paperwork became absurd. The provost marshal's office had to print new forms, thousands of them, because the supply ran out. A report from the 83rd Infantry Division noted, "We stopped counting after 15,000. We just kept moving them west," another officer wrote to headquarters. "We have more prisoners than rations." Even Eisenhower himself, in his field notes, seemed astonished. "The German army has disintegrated," he wrote, "not by destruction, but by collapse." He understood that what was unfolding in the Ruhr wasn't just a military defeat, it was psychological annihilation. An army was surrendering not from force, but from loss of faith. But behind those numbers were smaller, quieter details that never made it to the reports. Photographs taken by U.S. Signal Corps show the faces of boys, 16, maybe 17, wearing oversized uniforms. You can see the confusion in their eyes, the disbelief that this was how their war ended. Others, older men with gray beards and farmers' hands, carried the same expression, exhaustion more than fear. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were simply survivors. Interrogation transcripts from captured officers reveal a pattern. Many admitted they had received no clear orders for weeks. Communications had broken down completely. Fuel reserves were gone. Ammunition was rationed to a handful of rounds per man. When asked why they didn't fight, one colonel answered quietly, "We had no weapons left to fight with." Another said, "The men refused. They wanted to live." And yet, there were exceptions, pockets of resistance that fought to the last. In Duisburg, small SS detachments still held bridges under heavy bombardment. In Hagen, fanatical officers threatened to shoot anyone who tried to surrender. But even they were swallowed by the tide. One by one, strongpoints fell silent. The Germans called it Zusammenbruch, collapse. Aerial reconnaissance photographs show the Ruhr pocket from above, a black and white wound on the landscape. Roads clogged with vehicles, wagons, and men. Smoke rising from factories and barns set ablaze to prevent capture. U.S. engineers working alongside infantry units described walking through towns where every second building was rubble. The air smelled like burnt rubber and rain, one sergeant recalled. The prisoners didn't even look up. They just kept walking. In one report, an American doctor attached to the 104th Infantry Division wrote, "We treated them for frostbite, dysentery, malnutrition. Most had not eaten in days. Many didn't care what happened next, they just wanted the war to be over." But facts alone can't capture the scale of that surrender. The raw data, 325,000 captured, thousands of vehicles destroyed, entire divisions gone, feels almost mechanical. What those numbers don't show is the silence, the eerie stillness of battlefields where no one fired back. Soldiers standing in rain helmets, tilted, staring at their own boots. The sound of papers rustling as American officers filled out names and numbers that would soon be filed away in archives. It's strange how organized surrender can feel like chaos. Command posts became prisoner depots. Convoys that once carried ammunition now carried bread. German officers once feared stood politely before American clerks, waiting for identification tags. A photographer captured one such moment, a line of men wet from the rain, their caps tilted low. One man at the front looked into the lens. His expression said everything, not defeat, not relief, but something in between. Further west, in the towns of Soest and Una, U.S. field kitchens ran out of supplies. Soldiers gave away their own rations. "They were just kids," one American wrote home. Some of them thanked us. One even saluted me when I handed him coffee. It was a scene no one had expected, compassion replacing combat. Yet even amid the exhaustion, there was an undercurrent of disbelief. Allied intelligence officers couldn't understand how the German military, the same force that had conquered Europe, could fall apart so completely. Reports speculated about psychological contagion, the idea that surrender had spread like an infection. Once a few divisions gave up, the rest followed, convinced resistance was pointless. The illusion of strength evaporated. Historians later compared it to a dam breaking. For years, fear had kept the German army fighting. Fear of officers, fear of propaganda, fear of shame. But once that fear was gone, nothing held them back. The statistics confirm it. In February 1945, Allied forces captured about 10,000 prisoners per week. By mid-April, over 90,000 per day. It was the largest mass surrender in Western Europe since Napoleon's time. The U.S. Army called it a logistical success. The men on the ground called it something else, the death of an army. Because what they witnessed wasn't a battlefield victory. It was the implosion of belief itself. Every number, every report, every cold line of type tells the same story, that empires don't always end in blood. Sometimes they end in silence, in signatures on paper. in soldiers who no longer remember what they were fighting for. And somewhere between those numbers and faces, the truth waits, that surrender isn't just the absence of battle. It's the moment when the heart of a nation finally stops beating. Because by April 1945, the German army hadn't been destroyed. It had simply stopped existing. Morning came pale and soundless, a thin light crawling through the ruins of the Ruhr Valley. The mist hung low over the shattered roofs, and the earth smelled of metal smoke and rain. In a field just beyond the small village of Ludenscheid, hundreds of men stood in silence. Their uniforms were no longer uniforms, just fabric gray and torn, stained with oil soot and old blood. You could not tell rank from rags anymore. They had stopped saluting days ago. They barely spoke. They only breathed, slowly, together, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. Private Heinrich Bauer was 19. He had been drafted from a factory outside Dortmund just 6 months earlier. He had fired his rifle only twice, both times into the air. He stood there now, his weapon dropped into the mud beside him, his hands shaking not from fear but from exhaustion. The night before, his captain had vanished. The last order he heard was nothing more than a whisper: "Go west. Find the Americans. It's over." Across the field, a sound, the low, steady growl of engines. American tanks moved like shadows through the fog. Their outlines emerged, first broad shoulders of steel-white stars smeared with dirt. Then the voices calm, commanding, unfamiliar. "Keep your hands up. Step forward, slowly." The German soldiers obeyed. Not a single shot was fired. Boots pressed into wet soil. One by one, they crossed the invisible line where the war ended. An American corporal named James Rizzo watched from behind a jeep. He'd seen combat in Belgium in the Ardennes, where the snow had turned red and men froze where they fell. But this was different. He would later write in his notebook, "They came to us like ghosts." They didn't look beaten, they looked empty. He lit a cigarette, handed it to the first prisoner in line. The man hesitated, then took it between trembling fingers. He inhaled once deeply and exhaled as if releasing 5 years of war from his lungs. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Around them, the scene unfolded like a slow-motion flood. Lines of men, dozens wide, stretching down the road. Helmets tilted forward, rifles dropped in puddles, white rags tied to sticks. Some carried small bundles wrapped in cloth bread crusts, a photo, a letter. Others carried nothing at all. The air buzzed with the hum of engines and the soft rhythm of thousands of footsteps. It was the sound of surrender made flesh. There is a strange rhythm to collapse. It doesn't come in shouts or chaos. It arrives quietly, like fog seeping through a broken window. One man stops fighting, then another, and soon the silence becomes contagious. Even the birds had stopped calling that morning. The only movement was the slow wave of men moving westward, as if drawn by gravity. A medic from the 104th Infantry Division, Lieutenant Charles Dunn, walked among the prisoners with a clipboard and a bandaged hand. His uniform was soaked through from the night's rain. He stopped beside a young soldier sitting in the mud, his face buried in his hands. Dunn crouched and asked softly, "You hurt?" The boy looked up. Blue eyes, hollow cheeks, and shook his head. "Not here," he said, pressing his palm to his chest. Dunn didn't need a translator to understand. Hours passed. The Americans began to organize the captured men into columns. Trucks rolled in canvas flaps, whipping in the wind. 10 at a time, someone shouted. The German soldiers climbed aboard in silence. A few tried to smile in awkward gratitude, but most kept their heads down. The fear of being shot had been replaced by something heavier, the realization that survival had a price. Nearby, a sergeant from the U.S. 99th Division took a photograph. The lens captured the moment with brutal honesty. Hundreds of soldiers lined along the roadside, helmets off, eyes lowered. In the distance, an American flag fluttered on the hood of a jeep. When developed, the photo would show something more than surrender. It showed the moment when two worlds touched, and neither knew what to do with the other. Not all prisoners were calm. In another sector near Hagen, an SS officer tried to stop his men from giving up. He screamed orders, pistol raised, shouting that surrender was treason, that death was better than captivity. But his words dissolved into the wind. His men stood motionless, eyes fixed on the ground. One finally spoke quietly, almost kindly. "It's over, Herr Leutnant." When the officer turned his gun toward himself, no one moved to stop him. The shot echoed once, sharp and short. Then the line resumed, moving forward. The Americans had prepared for resistance, but what they met instead was obedience. Some soldiers saluted their captors out of old habit. Others asked in broken English, "Is it true, Hitler dead?" The news had not yet reached them. Some cried when they learned it wasn't true, others when they feared it was. For 5 years, that name had been their anchor. Now it was just another ghost, dissolving in the fog. As night fell, the field turned quiet again. Prisoners huddled under makeshift blankets, their breaths forming white clouds in the cold air. The Americans lit small fires, brewed coffee. Some of the captured men were allowed to sit near the flames. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was about home, about farms, near Dresden Sisters in Hamburg, a child they hadn't seen since 1939. The war had stripped them of everything but memory. Corporal Rizzo scribbled another line in his notebook. "I don't hate them anymore." He watched as one German soldier helped an American cook stir a pot of soup. "They're just tired," he wrote, "same as us." It was a quiet revelation, the kind that never makes it into textbooks. Somewhere far to the east, the thunder of the Red Army rolled closer. But here, in this patch of damp earth, time seemed to stand still. The prisoners slept in rows, the Americans kept watch, and above them the sky cracked open with the distant glow of artillery fire. It was like watching the last storm of the world fade over the horizon. By morning, the columns moved again. Trucks full of prisoners rolled west toward the Rhine. Civilians stood by the roadside, women, children, old men watching the endless procession of gray coats. Some spat. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared, not knowing whether to mourn or to be relieved. For the first time in years, the guns had fallen silent in this part of Germany. Later, in official reports, these scenes would be reduced to numbers, units, processed prisoners, counted meals, distributed. But in the eyes of those who were there, it was something far greater, or perhaps smaller. It was the moment when men stopped being enemies and became human again. Years later, Heinrich Bauer, the boy from Dortmund, would tell his grandson that the day he surrendered was the first day he truly lived. "I walked toward the Americans," he said, "and for the first time I wasn't afraid to die." Some stories of war end in explosions, in medals, in victory parades. But this one ends in silence, in the sound of boots sinking into wet earth, in the sight of men who no longer knew what they were fighting for, only what they wished to become. And as the camera pans across the field, faces turned upward to the pale gray sky, you realize something simple, something eternal, that sometimes the bravest act in war is to stop. By April 1945, Germany was not a nation at war anymore. It was a landscape of exhaustion. The numbers once built to inspire pride had turned into a ledger of decay. Where the Reich once produced 2,000 aircraft a month, it now scraped together a few dozen. Where once there were divisions with tanks and fuel, there were only names on paper. The factories still smoked, but inside. Machines stood silent, stripped of parts by men who no longer believed. Even the air had changed, quieter, now heavy with surrender. The contrast was unbearable. On one side of the front, America's war machine roaring like an iron tide. Convoys of trucks rolled day and night. Bombers darkened the sky in waves that never seemed to end. In the Ruhr pocket alone, American artillery fired more shells in 1 week than the entire German army could produce in a month. It wasn't just a battle anymore. It was mathematics. 4,000 Shermans against 400 Panthers, 12,000 planes against 300 fighters. It was the equation of inevitability. Eisenhower's staff in their reports wrote it plainly. Germany is outproduced, outgunned, outmaneuvered. But the truth went deeper. They weren't just losing a war of steel, they were losing a war of will. The Wehrmacht still had men on paper, but they were scattered, leaderless, and starving. Railway lines were gone, bridges bombed, communication fractured. Orders took days to travel miles. In some units, officers sent messengers on bicycles through enemy territory because radios no longer worked. And in those final days, the German army began to fracture from within. Frontline units ignored Berlin's commands. Some surrendered to the Americans even as their officers shouted to fight on. Soldiers hid their insignias, threw away pistols, burned flags. What was once an empire built on order had dissolved into confusion and instinct. The Allies saw it happening and pushed harder. From the west, Patton's Third Army advanced like a storm, armor columns stretching as far as the eye could see. From the north, Montgomery's forces cut off escape routes one by one. The map of Germany was closing like a fist. The encirclement of the Ruhr was complete. An entire army group trapped 325,000 men, surrounded by forces 5 times their number. American artillery never stopped. Day and night shells fell on what had once been the industrial heart of the Reich. The sky glowed red over Essen and Dortmund, a man-made sunset that never faded. Even Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted, "We could no longer sustain the illusion of control." The Reich was finished in all but name, and yet on the radio, the voice of the Führer still promised miracles. Secret weapons, new divisions, salvation from the east. But the men in the field had stopped believing. One prisoner later told an American interrogator, "When the radio spoke, we turned it off." That silence, that quiet rebellion, was the first real act of surrender. The folklore layer of the war was crumbling too. The myths that once bound the German soldier, duty, destiny, fatherland, all collapsing under the weight of starvation and truth. They had been told that the Americans were decadent, weak, divided by greed. But the reality that marched toward them, wore clean uniforms, carried chocolate and cigarettes, and fought with discipline, not hatred. The myths died slowly, like smoke dissipating in the morning sun. From the American side, it was a campaign of logistics more than battle. Engineers laid 6,000 feet of steel planking in 20 days to bridge rivers and move supplies. Airdrops delivered millions of gallons of fuel. The precision was relentless, calculated, mechanical, unstoppable. War reports from Schaeff describe it as momentum beyond resistance. For every German tank destroyed, 10 more Shermans rolled off assembly lines back home. For every bomber lost, 3 took its place in the sky. Germany was fighting against an idea it could no longer comprehend, a nation that could build faster than it could destroy. Inside the Ruhr, the scenes grew surreal. German officers drove to American lines in staff cars waving white handkerchiefs. Whole companies followed on foot, their rifles slung upside down. One American lieutenant recalled, "We'd been told to expect ambushes. Instead, we got traffic jams of men trying to surrender." But the surrender was not just military, it was psychological. By that spring, death itself had lost meaning. A man could die for a cause only as long as he believed it existed. The Reich, once painted on banners and carved into monuments, had become an illusion. The men in gray no longer fought for victory. They fought for a place to fall asleep without shells overhead. The numbers confirm what no rhetoric can hide. In the final 6 weeks of the war, nearly 2 million Germans laid down their arms to the Western Allies. The Ruhr was the largest, but not the last. The same pattern repeated across Bavaria, across the Elbe, across the remnants of an empire that no longer had a capital to serve. One statistic from the U.S. War Department stands out. The average duration of resistance within a surrounded German division, 36 hours. That's how long faith lasted once encircled, 36 hours between defiance and despair. The contrast grew clearer as the war dragged on. American troops were supplied with hot meals, clean uniforms, mail from home. German soldiers boiled bark for soup. Some had not seen meat in months. They wore mismatched boots, scavenged coats, and ammunition belts filled with empty casings. The American advantage wasn't cruelty, it was endurance. And then came the final blow, the sight of refugees. The roads clogged with civilians pushing carts, leading donkeys, carrying children with no shoes. The army that had once conquered Europe now walked beside its own victims. Soldiers saw what they had done and what it had cost. For many, surrender became not humiliation, but absolution. Even the officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler began to break. In captured diaries, phrases appear again and again, pointless now. We fight for ashes. Better captivity than dishonor. They were wrong, of course, the war still demanded its toll. But in their hearts, they had already left the battlefield. Historians would later write that Germany's defeat was inevitable by numbers alone, but those who lived it knew otherwise. The real collapse came not in factories or fuel tanks, but in the spirit of men. When the belief that had carried them through 5 years of destruction evaporated, the guns followed. The Americans didn't have to break them, they simply arrived. The hum of engines, the smell of diesel, the precision of movement, all of it told the same message: this war is already over. A field report from the 1st U.S. Army describes the final days inside the Ruhr. Enemy morale non-existent. Prisoners approach lines voluntarily. Resistance minimal. Officers surrendering en masse. It reads like an obituary. And yet, for all the statistics, there was still something haunting about it. An empire does not die quietly, even in surrender. It leaves echoes. The smoke rising from the Ruhr carried with it the ashes of 1,000 dreams. Dreams of empire, destiny, and domination, now drifting toward the same horizon where Allied bombers once came from. By mid-April, the numbers were complete. 325,000 men captured, 12,000 vehicles destroyed, 2,000 factories lost. The German army in the West had ceased to exist. But beyond those facts lies something deeper, the strange, tragic beauty of an ending that did not come with glory, but with silence. Because the truth is, no one truly won that spring. The victors carried ghosts of their own. The conquered carried the weight of what they had done. And Europe, the world, would spend generations trying to understand how so many could surrender not to force, but to the simple, crushing realization that belief itself had finally run out. Sometimes wars don't end when one side wins, they end when no one has the strength left to believe in losing. By the 3rd week of April 1945, the thunder had faded. What replaced it wasn't silence, not yet, but something softer, something hollow, like a great engine winding down after years of roaring. The war in the West had entered its last breath, and in that breath, the weight of millions hung suspended between guilt and survival. Across the Ruhr, the landscape had changed beyond recognition. Roads once carved by tanks were now rivers of prisoners. The fields that had been torn by artillery were covered in tents, vast, endless camps stretching to the horizon, filled not with soldiers, but with the remnants of an army that had simply ceased to exist. There were no flags, no anthems, no pride. Only names, numbers, and the thin rattle of tin cups against mess tins. The Americans called them Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. They sprang up overnight temporary prisons for the human tide that poured out of Germany's collapsing front. The soil was wet and heavy, turned to mud by the rain and by the weight of footsteps. Fences of barbed wire shimmered in the morning mist. There were no barracks, no roofs, no warmth. Just the open sky, gray and endless, pressing down on 300,000 men who had once believed themselves invincible. Field reports from the U.S. Army noted the impossibility of it all. Prisoners arriving faster than can be processed. Shortages of tents, blankets, food. One entry read simply, "We are running out of ground." Yet even here, amid exhaustion and confusion, there was an undeniable shift, a strange relief. For the first time in years, these men were not being hunted. They were alive. They no longer carried rifles. They no longer had to kill. They sat in groups, their voices low, smoking American cigarettes, talking about home. The smell of coffee drifted across the wire fences. An American guard, just 20 years old, watched them one night and wrote in his notebook, "They look like us, just older, just more tired." But the surrender carried a cost that no document could capture. For every soldier who exhaled in relief, there was another who could not bear the shame. Officers who had sworn loyalty to Hitler found themselves stripped of rank, forced to line up beside the very men they had once commanded. Some refused to eat. Some refused to speak. A few, unable to live with defeat, walked away into the darkness and never returned. Their names were never recorded. The shockwaves reached Berlin before the soldiers themselves did. Inside the Führerbunker, the news of the Ruhr's collapse arrived like a whisper through the walls. 1,000 men gone. Gone without a fight. Gone without an order. Hitler refused to believe it. He raged, demanded execution of the commanders, called them traitors. But no one answered. The phones were dead, the generals scattered, the army disintegrated. Even the air outside the bunker carried a new tone, the sound of inevitability. Joseph Goebbels tried to mask it on the radio, his voice sharp, trembling, promising vengeance, promising miracle weapons that would change everything. But the people no longer listened. The same broadcasts that once commanded loyalty now played to empty streets and shuttered windows. The myth had died quietly in the mud of the Ruhr, and somewhere in that collapse something deeply human emerged, something fragile, almost sacred. American soldiers hardened by years of fighting found themselves unable to hate the men behind the wire. They saw them washing their hands in puddles, carving spoons from scrap wood, mending shoes with wire. One American chaplain described it as watching the soul of an enemy return to its body. He wrote, "We have taken their weapons. Now they are only men." But history is never kind enough to end in simplicity. Alongside mercy came tragedy. The camps were overcrowded. The food was scarce. Rain turned the fields into swamps. Disease spread quietly, dysentery, fever, pneumonia. American reports admitted what could not be undone. Conditions poor. Supply inadequate. Mortality increasing. It wasn't cruelty, not deliberate. It was chaos, the cost of a war too large for anyone to manage. And yet, even as thousands languished, the world outside those fences was already rebuilding. The American columns rolled east toward the Elbe, where they would meet the Soviets in a handshake that split Europe in two. Cameras captured the moment, two armies smiling, shaking hands on a bridge, unaware that a new war, colder and quieter, was already beginning. For the German prisoners, time became a blur. Days melted into weeks, weeks into the slow rhythm of waiting. Some were sent to rebuild bridges they once defended. Others worked in fields under the same sun that had seen them surrender. Letters began to arrive, wives writing from ruined towns, mothers asking if they were alive. For many, captivity became the first place in years where truth was possible. The lies had burned away. All that remained was memory. One prisoner, Hans Müller, wrote in his diary, "I used to believe dying for Germany was the highest honor. Now I believe living for peace is harder." He traded his iron cross for a piece of bread and never looked back. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in homes from Chicago to Kansas, families read headlines that said, 325,000 surrender. For Americans, it was proof that victory was near. For the men behind the wire, it was a number that erased their names. In Berlin, as the city burned, Hitler dictated his final testament. He called the soldiers of the Ruhr cowards, unworthy of the Reich. But outside the bunker, in the ruins of the capital, the same silence that had swallowed the Ruhr was spreading. Civilians were surrendering too, not to soldiers, but to fate. Mothers waved white sheets from balconies. Children scavenged chocolate from the pockets of American GIs. The war had lost its reason. It had become habit. And then came the end, abrupt, anticlimactic, inevitable. May 8, 1945. Germany signed its unconditional surrender. But for those who had already laid down their arms in the Ruhr, the moment carried no triumph. They had surrendered not to paper, but to time itself. The war had ended for them weeks earlier in the quiet choice between dying for nothing or living for something unknown. Albert Speer would later write in his memoir, "We were not defeated by weapons. We were defeated by our own disbelief." And in that sentence lies the true weight of what happened. The surrender of 325,000 men was not the fall of an army, it was the collapse of a faith. When the war finally ended, many of those prisoners would walk home across a broken country. Some found their families. Others found only ashes, but all of them carried the same memory the day they stepped out of the fog, dropped their rifles, and saw the faces of their enemies for the first time without hate. A photograph survives, taken in late April. It shows a group of prisoners lined up beside a wooden fence, sunlight breaking through the clouds. One man looks directly at the camera. His face is gaunt, but his eyes are clear. Behind him, the sky is vast, empty, and full of light. It's not victory, not redemption, but something quieter. The beginning of a world learning to breathe again. And that is the echo the war left behind, not the roar of cannons, but the whisper of men who finally chose to stop. Some wars end with surrender, others with awakening. This one ended with both. The war ended, but the sound of it did not. Even when the guns fell silent, you could still hear it faintly in the echo of empty streets, in the low hum of trucks carrying prisoners home, in the way the wind moved through the broken glass of 1,000 windows. The war lived on, not in fire but in memory, and memory, unlike nations, does not surrender. The Rhine ran dark that summer, thick with silt, with the debris of bridges and tanks and dreams. On its banks, grass grew again, soft and green, covering the scars of trenches. The air smelled different now, damp, new, almost innocent. But beneath it all was something heavier, something that had settled into the soil like a whisper no one dared speak aloud. 325,000 men had surrendered rather than fight, and in doing so, they had become something larger than themselves. They were the proof that even in the heart of war there exists a boundary where the human spirit refuses to die for lies. They didn't surrender to the enemy, they surrendered to the truth. The truth that the war they fought for was already dead. The truth that the promise of glory had turned to dust. For years, historians would debate it, the numbers, the logistics, the politics. They would write of strategy, of encirclement, of the Ruhr pocket. But the real story is simpler and infinitely harder to tell. It is the story of tired men walking west under a gray sky, realizing that survival was the only form of victory left. Some of them never returned home. Disease, hunger, despair, even peace can kill slowly. Others rebuilt their lives in the ruins of what once was. They planted gardens where tanks had burned. They raised children who would never know the sound of artillery at night. They grew old with that memory buried deep the day they walked into captivity and found in the strangest way freedom. A few of those men spoke of it decades later in quiet voices on tapes now yellowed with time. One, a corporal from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, said softly, "We were not brave. We were just done." Another said, "The Americans were not our enemies that day. The war was." And maybe that is the secret history of that surrender, that the true enemy wasn't the man across the gun barrel, but the machine that told them to pull the trigger. They had been swallowed by propaganda, by fear, by pride. And when it all fell away, what remained was something pure, the instinct to live. Across the ocean, the victors celebrated. Parades, headlines, confetti raining down from skyscrapers. The war was over, the good guys had won. But if you listened closely, beyond the cheers, beyond the speeches, you could still hear the quiet questions rising from the Rhine. What did victory mean when the world itself was in ruins? What does it mean to win a war that no one truly survives? The answer perhaps lies in the silence that followed. Because after the war, Europe became a continent of whispers. People spoke softly, as if loud words might wake the ghosts again. Cities rebuilt themselves out of ashes, not out of pride. The victors and the defeated alike shared the same sky, the same fear of forgetting, and the same fear of remembering. The Americans who guarded the prisoners never forgot either. Some wrote home about it, letters tucked in drawers unseen for years. One wrote they were supposed to be our enemies, but watching them eat, sleep, talk about home, I saw my own reflection. Another wrote simply, "We won, but I don't feel like it." Because war is never a story of sides, it is a story of mirrors. Each man in his own way looking at another version of himself. The surrender of those 325,000 soldiers wasn't just the end of Germany's war. It was the end of belief in the illusion that war could ever be noble. The Rhine meadow camps emptied slowly through the summer. One by one, the men were sent east-west home. They left behind trenches dug by their own hands' footprints that the rain would soon erase. A few carved their names into wooden posts as if to remind the earth they had existed. Then they vanished into history, but the land remembers. It always does. On some quiet evenings, if you walk along the fields near Remagen or Essen, when the mist rolls in from the river and the light fades to silver, you can almost hear it again. The murmur of men waiting for dawn. The soft rhythm of boots in mud. The rustle of 1,000 white flags fluttering in a cold spring wind. Those echoes are all that remain of an empire that once promised eternity. And maybe that's what surrender really is, not defeat, but the recognition that eternity was never ours to begin with. The children of those soldiers would grow up in a different world, one divided not by trenches, but by walls of ideology and fear. Yet even they carried the silent inheritance of that moment in 1945. The lesson that sometimes the bravest act a man can make is not to fight, but to stop. Every generation since has lived beneath that echo. Every conflict that followed Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, carries in its shadow the ghost of the Ruhr. A reminder that war is not sustained by weapons, but by belief. And when belief breaks, armies collapse. Empires fall. The world begins again. And yet, as the narrator's voice softens, as the film grain flickers over the final images, there is a question that lingers, refusing to fade. What would we have done if we were standing there in that rain-soaked field? Would we have surrendered or fought on? Would we have had the courage to live when everything around us demanded death? History will never answer that. It can only show us the faces blurred, exhausted human and ask us to listen. Not to the speeches, not to the numbers, but to the silence that came after. Because that silence was not emptiness. It was the sound of the world exhaling after 6 years of holding its breath. Some wars end with parades, others end with graves. But this one, the surrender of 325,000 men who chose life over death, ended with a whisper that still moves through time. It says, "Enough, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first true victory of the war."